Like, if you watch this video with fresh eyes, not knowing a single thing, you would literally be more confused by the end of the video, especially because it literally just does not talk about the motivations, the intent, the ambitions of any of the parties involved. All right,
Look at this.
let's get to Jonald Harris, okay? Mr. Jonald Harris did a video about Hezbollah, and I want to watch it because everyone wants me to watch it. I haven't watched it in a while. I haven't watched Jonald Harris in a while, so let's watch that. Some of you are going to be watching a 3-minute ad break at the top of the hour instead of this. Now, of course, if you want to avoid this fate, all you need to do is subscribe, as you know. Here's the 3-minute ad break now.
This map shows the thousands of attacks that have occurred right here on this border, just over the past year, in this fight between Israel and one of their biggest regional enemies, Hezbollah. Hezbollah is one of the biggest armed groups in the world that isn't a nation's military. They have tens of thousands of trained soldiers and hundreds of thousands of missiles and rockets capable of reaching targets all across Israel. This threat led Israel to conduct a massive set of attacks against Hezbollah,
This large explosion was seen near Beirut's international airport,
in which they killed almost all of the group's top leaders, weakening Hezbollah immensely, followed by a full-on invasion by Israeli troops to denigrate this group even further. This has been a massive escalation that is now...
Okay, we're 56 seconds in, and no mention of, like, the deterrence principles set forth by the axis of resistance against Israel and the United States of America in the region. And it's just like missiles just started flying randomly. No mention of Sheba Farms, which is disputed territory that Israel currently occupies, that Syria believes is Lebanese land, and Hezbollah also believes is Lebanese land. And how the first rocket fired in that direction was still fired in the direction of Sheba Farms in general, and that beyond that, the back and forth missile campaigns were predominantly, I mean, it was 80% of the rockets fired in the cross-border tit-for-tat conflict was fired by Israel into Lebanon. So right off the jump, I feel like there's a lot of details being omitted here. I'm sure it's not deliberate. Capable of reaching all targets in Israel? What? He's right. He's not wrong about that. That part is correct. Hezbollah does have missiles that are capable of reaching all targets in Israel. They have a significantly better defense capability. They have significantly better missiles than Hamas, for example. Hamas's bathtub rockets.
Spilling over into this entire region. And to understand how we got here, you really have to understand where Hezbollah came from, and what this group's fierce 40-year struggle tells us about how the modern Middle East came together, and how it's now coming apart. The geopolitics of the Middle East is complicated and sensitive, and there's a lot going on right now, which makes navigating the news pretty difficult, which is why I'm glad that the sponsor of today's video exists. Thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring today's video. Ground News is this new tool that I'm very excited about. What it does is it aggregates news stories from around the world, important and timely story of the rise of Hezbollah. The story of Hezbollah really starts when the vast Ottoman Empire broke apart in the early 1900s. Europeans came in and sliced all of this up, France taking all of this territory. But then
it was picked apart by other imperial powers with colonial interests in the region. Just saying. It was what they picked up as winnings. I mean, that's what happened.
They drew a line here to carve out this little mountainous region, one that was populated mostly by Maronite Christians. But the border didn't include just Christians. The French made sure to include this area to the east and this area to the south, areas that contained large populations of Shia Muslims, who were now forced into this new country where they were made a minority to the Christians, along with a few other religious groups. We're going to focus a lot down here, on this Shia heartland that would eventually become one of the most important regions in the whole Middle East. In 1940,
You defend Iranian intervention in Lebanon, but not U.S. intervention in Vietnam. Hassan thinking American proxies are bad, but Iranian proxies are good. You criticize the Americans in Vietnam, but not the Iranians in Lebanon. Shaking my head. There's something very funny about installing a puppet state in southern Vietnam that is like insanely fascist while simultaneously bombing the Vietnamese population, both in southern Vietnam, northern Vietnam, and even surrounding countries, versus like a Shia militancy that rose up, that I'm sure even Johnny Harris would probably openly recognize. Hold on, just before you start jumping to conclusions, there is a difference, okay? There is a difference. The difference is Iran wasn't pummeling Lebanon as the largest imperial power at the time, while simultaneously saying like, you're going to be ruled by these guys. This is something that a lot of people always fail to comprehend. And it's very strange. American installation of puppet states, specifically fascist puppet states, are not in line with like any sort of ethnic group that it has any sort of like serious popular momentum. They don't have like popular mobilization. That's why it's usually dictatorial. The comparison between the South Vietnamese government and Hezbollah is not a apt comparison for this reason. Iran does not have the power to be able to look at Lebanon and say, we are going to run Lebanon in the same way that America thought that they had the capacity to run Vietnam. Despite the fact that you think Iran is justified because of the USA starting all this, which I agree with, but then go and state Iran can influence Lebanon. I'm not saying that Iran can influence Lebanon, okay? Iran, at the very most, can only offer logistical support to a group of individuals that live in Lebanon that became the primary fighting force within Lebanon. If you think that you have to assume that like Iran has mind control powers or something, and Iran was also not peppering Lebanon with Agent Orange in the same time frame with genuine imperial interest. The axis of resistance and the dynamic within the axis of resistance changes throughout time, including but not limited to Hamas's allegiances, both in the Syrian war and in other times, specifically, especially when considering that Hamas itself is not even a Shia group. They are Sunni Muslim. Even if Israel and USA were absent from the Middle East, Iran and Saudis would be at each other's throats. This part of the conversation is also not incorrect. I think that this is fair. The problem is you cannot ever imagine Israel and USA being absent from the Middle East, and that especially the Saudi reign without U.S. intervention would be non-existent. So I don't know why you're talking, or Saudi Arabia in the way that it exists currently would not be a thing without the United States of America nor Israel. It is incorrect. Yeah, exactly. See, it's incorrect. If the U.S. was absent from the Middle East, Saudis wouldn't exist. Saudis propped up by the U.S.
3. Lebanon gains its independence from France. It creates a constitution meant to balance the power between all.
Also, yeah, ironically enough, the Iranian Ayatollah regime would not exist without American intervention. What are we talking about? I can't believe I got so captured by the framing that this chatter was presenting that I forgot a pivotal part of this process, which is that the Ayatollahs are directly a reaction to American imperialism and American statecraft in Iran specifically. We have routinely with this area. We have routinely with every single country in this area, which is a resource-rich region. So we have to do that. You know, they got that thick, juicy WorldCom that we need. And then we're just like, oops, sorry. Well, these guys are really scary. We just have to continue intervening. And there's nothing we can do.
All of these religious groups. But that balance wouldn't last, mostly thanks to what started happening down here.
Like, dude, the example with Norway is apt because Norway is a country that has nationalized its extraction industries in its entirety. And one thing that I've always found, albeit reductive, is a great comparison between Norway. If these countries were allowed to develop and maybe even find themselves within the sphere of influence of the USSR, do you think without American intervention, they would look the way that they do? If they did not, if American intervention and a reactionary movement against said intervention became the only emancipatory movement against such intervention, if those things did not exist, don't you think that these countries could have developed on their own, had their own nationalist movements, that may have even found themselves again in the sphere of USSR influence at times? But ultimately, don't you think that that would be beneficial for the area, for these people to have some level of sovereignty rather than be like colonial cutouts of vassal states that play a role in American empire, in Western imperialism in general? Why can't that happen? Why could that never happen? Is it because we just seemingly think when we look at these countries that they're just barbaric? They have a barbaric bone in their brains and they just can't seem to deal with themselves. They can't have any autonomy. They can never have any sovereignty whatsoever because ultimately they're just animals that need to be dominated. Is that what it is? And the answer is, I think that is the underlying sentiment with Western empire. That is literally just repackaged colonial propaganda, that these guys cannot handle themselves. Okay? So we have to handle it for them. That's unironically what the problem is here. That is how we have historically approached this process. Israel's invention, its inception, its nation statehood relies on this attitude. We had to bring in a bunch of people from the West specifically that we know are our guys to a certain degree, that we can directly control and directly have a say in, that want to create a Western version of society there that need to exist there in an incredibly violent manner with mass displacement and complete domination of the local indigenous population so that we always have a foothold in the region.
Where another set of borders were being carved into the Middle East. The British had controlled this, but in 1948 they left, and the UN helped draw these new lines, creating a new Israel and Palestinian state. Decades of war forced out millions of Palestinians, many of whom ended up here in Lebanon. These Palestinians are mostly Sunni Muslim.
Right, but these are still bourgeoisie states based on exploitation. Somehow concluding that they would not consume each other is ridiculous. Okay, the Rupert Murdoch. The point is, it would be far more favorable to every single person living in these countries that were, once again, not even designed on any sort of real national boundary that they wanted to set during this time, but instead colonial cutouts anyway, that they could have autonomy and sovereignty and be normal nation states that could develop and have, money that they want to spend in whichever direction they want to spend it in. Like the idea that some groups of people are simply barbaric and would never be able to amount to any sort of serious governance, self-governance, is ridiculous. It is an antiquated and white supremacist idea that still dominates this region, or at least still dominates the way that we understand this region. If you don't think that European capitalist countries that are bourgeois states themselves are consistently dominating one another right now, then you can understand a similar cooperation could absolutely occur here as well. Unless you think there's something different within the mind of the Arab, okay? Unless you personally think that the mind of the Arab is servile, worthy of domination, not worthy of dignity. They just simply can't control themselves. They always want to eat each other alive. Same with Africa.
So this upsets the carefully laid power balance in Lebanon and further marginalizes the Shia Muslims who were fighting for their place in the country. Then in 1971, an armed militia made up of Palestinians called the Palestinian Liberation Organization moves to Lebanon, and they turn this whole region, which again was made up of mostly Shias, into their own little mini-state. You start to see that Lebanon is descending into division between the different militias and powers controlling parts of the country. And in the mid-70s, it all breaks down into a full-fledged civil war between a dizzying number of religious factions. It's a war that will pull in much of the Middle East.
What happened that caused them to go there? Just they were just moving in? Why was there a Palestinian liberation movement at all? We didn't just that was not a thing. I guess they just anti-Semitism, maybe? Would they not say it's the Islamic ideology rather than the mind of Arabs? That's so, again, that you're just repackaging the same thing, okay? Yes, it's the same exact attitude. It is the same thing. It's the difference between Ben Shapiro saying, oh, it's not the race of the black person in America that is inferior. It is their culture. It's just a repackaged version of the same propaganda that makes it seem more permissible to a broader audience. Literally, when you hear someone say, oh, black people aren't genetically inferior, it's not something to do with their race, it's just their culture that keeps them down, understand that you're talking to a racist person. They just don't want to openly say that black people are inferior racially or genetically. Their reception, seemingly, to the only real cultural output that America really has, if we're being honest, is actually they receive their own culture differently than white people do. White people are still, of course, the largest consumers of black culture. That's another part of the equation here. Anyway.
And it's a war whose most important region is down here, in this border zone between Israel and Lebanon, the place that will soon give rise to Hezbollah. Now let's talk about Syria. They're here right next door and they're watching this civil war. And they decide to invade, to prop up the Maronite Christian ruling class, who've become Syria's allies. They want to do this to prevent the civil war from spilling over into their territory. At this point, Syria also considers annexing the entire country of Lebanon, making it a part of Syria. But eventually the relationship between Syria and Maronite Christians breaks down, and Syria continues to occupy this part of the country. Meanwhile, to the south, Israel fears that Syria is growing too powerful. It also wants to wipe out the PLO, who is attacking them across the border from Lebanon. So in 1978, Israel enters the fray, invading from the south and driving deep into the country. Israel succeeds in temporarily suppressing the PLO, but in the process, it displaces hundreds of thousands of locals, most of them Shia Muslims.
It's just sad how that accidentally happened. It's cool that Israel always has a good justification for it. You know, I'm glad at least they have a justification. They must have. Israel has a right to defend itself. Yeah, they just kind of entered the fray, and they had a right to defend themselves.
It eventually withdraws after a UN resolution. But then in 1982, after more PLO attacks, Israel invades again, this time pushing all the way to Beirut, fighting both the PLO and Syria. And this is where the conflict takes on a new dimension. It's 1979, and over in Iran, the people have risen up against the US-backed dictator in this Islamic revolution led by a Shia Muslim cleric who wants...
How'd he get there? How'd this guy get there? I don't know. What was he doing? Probably good stuff, right? I mean, those guys are always good.
In this Islamic revolution led by a Shia Muslim cleric who wants to spread this revolution throughout the region. He's looking for allies. And in 1982, they find their perfect match here in southern...
Like everything that occurred is within the context of the Cold War. Like you cannot frame this outside of... You cannot look at these events that are unfolding without understanding why America was so interested in both propping up Israel and destabilizing the entire region, because most of these countries were, in a way that is not dissimilar to like the BRICS dynamic, I guess, but even though the BRICS dynamic is like a little bit different here, weighing their options of who they could align themselves with. They see America as a destabilizing force in the region. They see the USSR as being more sympathetic, at least, especially certain groups see the USSR as being more sympathetic. And basically, they want to dominate as fast as possible. They want to destabilize and dominate as fast as possible. That's partially what happens in Iran as well. The problem is, you know who also is definitely not going to align with the USSR? Islamist fundamentalists, for the most part. Problem, however, is that they also are seen, due to their fundamentalist attitudes, seen as, I guess, the only real uncorrupted forces. Ironically enough, in many of these places, they are directly funded and facilitated and radicalized by the Western governments, by specifically the CIA. But it doesn't matter. In the eyes of the population, they're like, well, these are our guys. These are like the most annoying guys in the area. And they probably are not like, they They seemingly are more anti-America than anybody else, and I don't want any sort of intervention from the British or the Americans, so I'll just go with those guys. Better than the monarch puppet that was placed on top of me that's dominating my life every day. Sure, we'll take a chance with this guy. And from the perspective of the United States of America, but what exactly were the Soviet interests in Iran? The mullahs called America the greater Satan and the USSR as the lesser Satan? No, you're describing exactly what I'm saying. Islamist fundamentalists are, in the eyes of the American state, Islamist fundamentalists are less likely to align with the USSR's interests because the USSR is also spreading atheism within countries in its periphery. The USSR is also forcibly Russifying many of the regions that have a ton of Muslims inside of its own territorial boundaries. This presents a threat for a lot of the Islamist fundamentalists as well. This is part of the reason why in Afghanistan especially, you saw a bunch of Islamist militias propped up by the United States of America with the deliberate interest of bringing the USSR in to deal with a lot of that the Afghan government was doing that was, aligned with the USSR at the time. But their goal was to specifically fund and offer logistical support and radicalize the Mujahideen movement so that Russia would go in to intervene, a gamble that actually panned out really well for them in the short term, which may have led to the demise of the USSR that spread itself too thin, but then kind of backfired dramatically on the United States of America when 9/11 happened, or I guess depending on whose perspective we're looking at, it paid out dividends later down the line for the American military industrial complex. I'm not saying that I'm not saying that Islamists were USSR aligned at all. I'm simply stating that predating Islamist movements in these countries, which always existed but were nascent in comparison to like social democratic pan-Arabist pan-Arabic nationalist movements, or even, dare I say, socialist pan-Arabic nationalist movements, which presented a much graver threat to the United States' interests in the region. They played a little bit fast and loose with propping up Islamist groups that were never going to align with the USSR in their own calculation. Does that make sense? But that is a bit reductive. The USSR never gave the same degree of support to their guys like the US did in that area. Afghanistan is sort of an exception, but for example, when Egypt was attacked by Israel, the USSR did not react and even had a weapons embargo on it. Yes. Well, they also had significantly, they had limitations in comparison to America. But not only that, but also I'm not talking about like the USSR's willingness of cooperation. I'm talking about America's fears that they might cooperate. Does that make sense? Anyway, the point is for the mullahs, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, they obviously were coming off the heels of refusing Western intervention and had developed a genuine distaste for it. And I'm sure that they used any kind of sectarian boundaries that they could to their advantage. Well, not I'm sure, that's what they did.
Southern Lebanon. It's a militia that rose to defend against outsiders trampling their heartland. It's called Hezbollah, which means Party of God. Iran picked this group in particular because it shares its goals of Islamic revolution and a deep distrust and disdain for Israel. Iran starts providing Hezbollah with money, weapons, soldiers, training, and leadership. And in return, Hezbollah proclaims loyalty to the Iranian Revolution and its supreme leader. What started as Lebanese Civil War is now a regional war that is heating up. So the United States enters, leading an international peacekeeping mission to try to calm these tensions. But of course, Hezbollah and Iran hate this. They now have two prime targets in their backyard, Israel and these Western powers led by the US. So in 1983, they launch a series of terrorist attacks. A truck bomb detonated in front of a US and French barracks in Beirut that kills over 300 people. Most of the world blames not only Hezbollah, but also its backer, Iran. The fighting continues until 1989, when the mini
terrorist attacks against Europeans in Lebanon. Yeah. They called it peacekeeping. So obviously, yes, any sort of action taken against any sort of action taken against, unless it's Israel blowing up peacekeepers, then it's okay. Then they have a right to defend themselves, okay?
Many groups fighting this civil war come to a peace agreement, one that bans all militias and requires them to give their weapons back to the government. But there's a big catch here. Israel still occupies what they call this security buffer zone in southern Lebanon. So the peace agreement makes an exception specifically for efforts that resist the Israeli occupation, aka they allow Hezbollah to continue to exist, turning them into something more than just one of these militias fighting for their group. It gives them a kind of official status to continue acting as a defender of southern Lebanon, the country's bulwark against Israel. They also develop into more of a political party that gains seats in Lebanon's legislature, kind of serving as a parallel government, providing social services in the areas that it controls.
But they did that also in a sinister fashion, just so you know. They were doing that in a sinister way. When they were offering social safety nets, they did that in an evil way. I need you to understand that. A Islamic style social safety net.
Look at Hezbollah in this moment, because they find themselves in the middle of shifting power games in the Middle East, balancing their mandate to defend their Shia heartland, which was their founding motivation, but also trying to gain further influence in the region, while also appeasing the demands of their major supporter, Iran. In 2005, Lebanon's prime minister is assassinated, and most Lebanese blame Hezbollah, along with its other foreign supporter, Syria. Lebanese people rise up in mass protest, and Syria eventually withdraws its forces that have occupied Lebanon for 28 years. Hezbollah is disgraced. Its legitimacy is supposed to come from resisting foreign meddling, and it's becoming clear that they have become a pawn in the geopolitical game of regional powers, Syria and Iran.
I don't understand why a lot of this conversation like always makes any kind of like indigenous group or any kind of like sect that exists in the region, it denies them agency in its entirety. Like it makes it seem like these the Shia dudes that were there were just like, but we love our neighbors, like we don't want to fight Israel, don't make us fight Israel, please. And then Iran's like, no, you have to fight them. And they're like, no, like, I hate that, but like, I just got to do that. Obviously, no such extension is given to no such analysis exists for like phalangist militias or even Israel for that matter, in terms of like them having agency and autonomy.
But the group is able to turn Syria's withdrawal into their advantage. The Syrian occupation had kept Lebanon somewhat stable, so as soon as they left, it creates this power vacuum and allows Hezbollah to take more territory.
Wait, did he say... what?
They have become a pawn in the geopolitical game of regional powers, Syria and Iran. But the group is able to turn Syria's withdrawal into their advantage. The Syrian occupation had kept Lebanon somewhat...
Is it just me, or is it absurd to just say they killed 300 people and not mention that they're U.S. Marines? Am I mistaken? Or is even CIA Harris usually a bit more fair and accurate than this? No, I think that when he wrote, a video, like he made a YouTube short about the Israeli settler ambitions of occupying South Lebanon, which is real. He was yelled at, and then he literally deleted the video and apologized for it. And this is in that same vein. Hey everyone, earlier today I published a short form video about a group of Israelis who are calling for people to move in and build settlements in southern Lebanon in an effort to expand Israel's territory. I likened it onto the settler movement that had led to illegal settling of Israelis in the West Bank after 1967. I'm realizing now that I was wrong to equate the two. This is a different situation. While some Israelis do want to expand Israel's territory by attempting to settle southern Lebanon, this is a fringe group that, under the current status quo, has no feasible chance of expanding Israel's occupation and changing Israel's borders. This may change as the conflict escalates, but for now, the comparison was an inaccurate characterization. I will also refuse to recognize that the way that this was propagandized and packaged was also a fringe movement that was not really backed by the Israeli state, even though it totally was backed by the Israeli state, both quietly and also publicly. And now we just kind of take it for granted because it just happened to exist that way. This may change the conflict escalates, but for now, the comparison was an inaccurate characterization. I hope you trust that when these errors come to my attention, I will do my best to assess the error and immediately issue a correction and let you all know about it. Thanks for your patience. Yeah, he took down the video because he made a correct take. Just saying.
But stable. So as soon as they left, it creates this power vacuum and allows Hezbollah to take more territory, ramping up attacks across the border against Israel and leading to another brief war with the IDF. Hezbollah continues to be a useful proxy for Iran, and Iran continues to fund them and arm them. And by 2011, Iran and Syria pull Hezbollah into another unpopular conflict.
They were just kind of doing that for fun, like for no reason. They were anti-Semitically, if I might add, anti-Semitically, but also like at the behest of Iran as well, and not necessarily due to their own personal ambition or motivation of wanting to rid Israel of their territorial boundary. 2006 war, yeah. The PLO just kind of disappeared from the story. Strange, yeah. It's just weird because, like, if you were to look at this entire story, there's almost always this uniting principle, which is that people don't want to get blown up by a Western-backed state that routinely, also in their own way, collaborates with some of the most rabid freaks in the region that end up doing unimaginable war crimes. Like, we're talking about the 300 Marines that were bombed by Hezbollah. That is, and this is a parallel that you might understand exists with October 7. That is utterly incomprehensible in comparison to the magnitude's worst carnage that Israel has brought upon both Lebanon and every other surrounding country in the region. What's interesting, especially when you skip the 2006 invasion that he just considered a brief war, is that all of these instances of Israeli incursion, which aren't simply just like a tit-for-tat military operation, targeted, precise, but almost identical to the death and destruction that you see in Gaza right now, as Israel's military doctrine for the way that it conducts itself in these quote-unquote wars is the Dahiyya doctrine, is complete destruction of all matter of civilian infrastructure. And of course, when that happens, when that much death and destruction is something that people are experiencing in the hands of a Western-backed militant settler colonial state in the region, understandably, the people are going to inevitably go, yeah, I don't give a who's doing this. I don't give a who's defending me. I'm with those guys. I don't even care. I don't agree with them. They're not great. I don't agree with their worldview. I don't agree with the way that they treat me in certain instances, but I'd rather, I'm happy that they're fighting.
Syria's civil war. But this hurts Hezbollah's reputation because now they're fighting on behalf of Syria's brutal Iran-backed regime. These once liberators have turned into foot soldiers of oppression, doing the bidding of outsiders. But its last source of legitimacy continues to be its resistance to Israel, something that Lebanon's own government is too weak to do. This remains their source of legitimacy today. So on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas...
Why is the Lebanese government weak to defend its own territorial sovereignty, I wonder? I mean, they have a security partnership with the United States of America. Also odd that they just don't have anti-aircraft missile systems. I just don't know how a country can have any sort of territorial sovereignty in a region where they are so closely surrounded by other countries. Some of which used to have aircrafts that they could use, and others that could at least lob missiles. Why is it that they don't have any sort of anti-aircraft missile systems? Why is it that they don't have, despite the security cooperation and partnership that they have with the American government, why don't they have some of the latest and greatest technology that is afforded to America's allies in the region? Jordan doesn't either. I wonder why. No, Jordan does have anti-aircraft missile systems. They do. They use it to defend Israel. They actually do have them. Lebanon doesn't. I just don't know why. Yeah, Jordan has a fleet. They have anti-aircraft missile systems. Lebanon doesn't.
And Israel descended into this most recent war, Hezbollah jumped in, launching more attacks against Lebanon's southern border. This is meant to support Hamas in the Gaza Strip and to threaten Israel with a war on two fronts. At first, it seemed to be working. Tens of thousands of Israelis have had to evacuate the towns and villages in northern Israel. So Israel
I mean, I've answered this question before, but I will answer it again. Lebanon can't have anti-aircraft missile systems because you wouldn't want American anti-aircraft weaponry blowing up Israeli fighter jets that are also American. That would be weird, don't you think? It would be weird to give this country that we have security cooperation with any kind of defense capabilities that would then inevitably blow up Israeli fighter jets that are on their way to bomb Beirut.
Israel started firing back across the border, forcing 90,000 people in southern Lebanon from their homes. This, in addition to Israeli strikes on Iranian proxies and military officials, led Iran to fire its first ever direct strike on Israel, trying to deter it from going any further. But it didn't work. In September of 2024, Israel escalated.
Okay, this part is actually kind of surprising. He talked about, like, he low-key talked about Iranian deterrence.
Surprising.
Even though I don't think he brought up why Iran retaliated.
Hezbollah with a series of attacks that killed a large part of the group's top leadership, including their decades-long leader. A few days later, Israel sent troops across this border with the goal of further weakening Hezbollah, trying to make the situation safe for Israelis to return home to the north of the country. And now, with Hezbollah in shambles...
That's interesting. This directly contradicts what he was saying about the settler movement, but I guess he already packed that angle up.
Its sponsor, Iran, felt compelled to act.
What we are all seeing with our own eyes is a major attack from Iran.
It's a major attack, Dana, and it's an escalation. It's an escalation.
So even if Hezbollah eventually begins to rebuild itself, it's unclear what role they will play in Iran's proxy network. But what is clear is that the clash between these two Middle East powers remains the central force animating this region towards more and more violence. And these recent events show us clearer than ever that Hezbollah was just one foot soldier in this growing...
Yeah, Israel blew up an Iranian embassy building in Syria, killing Iranian officials. That was violating Iranian sovereignty. And the second Iranian missile salvo came because Iran retained the right to retaliate to Israel assassinating Ismail Haniyeh, the principal negotiator and the chief of the Hamas Politburo, person primarily responsible with civil governance. And once again, it's important to repeat, the principal negotiator on the ceasefire deal. Israel assassinated him in Tehran, once again violating Iranian sovereignty.
Conflict between these two powers.
I mean, this was unimaginably reductive. I find it strange that it's not even like omitting details to make it seem more presentable to a Western audience. But I just don't understand why you would never like put forth motivations and the ambitions of people that are that make up these militia movements, right? Like that's just like you don't have to agree with it. You don't have to agree with them. You could do the Benny Morris thing and be like, yeah, you know, you can pull up Benny Morris and be like, yeah, the Nakba happened, but it was good. You know what I mean? You could technically look at the motivations and describe them, even if you don't agree with those motivations. The problem is Americans like to see themselves as like the heroes in every story. And they like to see themselves on the side of the heroes, on the side of the rebel groups, right? And I think one of the problems is that, did you skip the 2006 war? I often rely on them to gain a better understanding of global events. However, as a Lebanese with deep insight into this particular situation, I found your video to be somewhat misleading. It skips over key events and seems to take sides of certain points. I'd be willing to provide a detailed breakdown, pinpoint specific timestamps where the content could be more accurate, but I'm hesitant to invest the effort. if it's just going to be overlooked. If you're truly committed to presenting objective, truthful information, misleading to the point where it's almost propaganda. Just 5 minutes in, and this video is so inaccurate. This video is made for people who have no idea what's going on, and after they will still... This is what I was thinking as well. Like, if you watch this video with fresh eyes, not knowing a single thing about, like, the inception of Hezbollah, like, Israel, like, you would literally be more confused by the end of the video, especially because, like, it literally just does not talk about the motivations, the intent, the ambitions of any of the parties involved, which is ironic because he doesn't even do that for Israel. He does it a little bit for Israel where he'll be like, oh, they wanted to defend themselves. But like, if you knew nothing and you came into this with fresh eyes and you wanted to like learn about at least a couple talking points, you'd be like, what the did I just watch? It just seems like a bunch of people were motivated to fight for no reason, including at times even the Israeli occupying force. It's just kind of a thing that happened. People are violent and religious, and they just fight each other all the time. People be fighting. Doesn't every force enact foreign policy on their material interests like both Israel and Hezbollah should be rational actors even if they aren't nice? Yes, that is precisely the point. That is what I'm saying. Like, in a weird way, he didn't even do that thing. He didn't even do the thing where they're like, oh, their motivation is that they're bloodthirsty and anti-Semitic. Like, he didn't even point the intent in the Lebanese direction or Hezbollah's direction as like some vague generalized anti-Semitic perspective. Maybe he was just feeling like he hasn't done a lot of videos in a while or something. I don't know. You started the video from the Ottoman Empire, conveniently omitted settler colonial tactics of Israel, and jumped directly to PLO. Convenient, bro, convenient. The phrasing used on this video is highly misleading. It reads more like propaganda than something genuinely intended to inform or educate. Here's a list of Israeli atrocities committed in this time period that this guy skipped. Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982. Israeli forces allowed a Lebanese Christian militia, the Phalange, to enter the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Beirut. Over 2 days, they massacred between 700 and 3,500 Palestinian civilians. Yeah. They also blocked the civilians from escaping so that the Phalange's militias could slaughter them. Operation Grapes of Wrath, 1996. Israel launched a large-scale military operation against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. During the campaign, Israeli artillery shelled a UN compound in Qana where hundreds of Lebanese civilians had taken refuge. 2006, Lebanon War. In response to Hezbollah capturing 2 Israeli soldiers, Israel launched a massive military campaign in Lebanon. The war resulted in 1,100 Lebanese deaths, mostly civilians. Like, if you don't mention any of this stuff, you can't understand how the Hezbollah rose to prominence. Hezbollah rose to prominence, gained any sort of like unlikely allegiances from the rest of Lebanese society, which is understandably primed to despise them. Blockade and wars on Gaza, settlements and forced evictions in the West Bank, killing of Palestinian protesters, treatment of Palestinian detainees, disproportionate response in conflicts, collective punishment, targeting of civilian infrastructure. Like, what is the PLO? Like, that's the question that I would have. I'd be like, what? The PLO? What is that? Why are they in this area that you're saying is Jordan? But on the maps, when I look at it now, it looks a little different. Like, what happened there? How did they go to Lebanon? Why did they go to Lebanon? Why do they exist? What is Palestine? The PLO didn't simply move to Lebanon. It was expelled from Jordan during the events of Black September because the organization attempted a coup against the king, as it also considered Jordan part of the future state of Palestine. You explain where they attacked, but never explain why they attacked. Telling the history of the region without speaking one bad word about what Israel did all these years is truly something shameful to do. This video makes me wonder what other videos you made that have been inaccurate. Congratulations, you've just lost a subscriber. Can't see any shallower description of reality. Even his maps are bullshit and contain an agenda. This doesn't even begin to tell the full story. I've lost so many family members at a little village in Lebanon, literally in the middle of nowhere. They live off the land and everyone lived a simple life. Then bombs started dropping left and right. Now everyone has left a beautiful mountainside my father and generations before him used to call home. People on both sides need to stop killing each other. This has gone too far. Sloppy work. Love how the Nakba was reduced to decades of war forced out millions of Palestinians. Highly inaccurate and misleading video. Easy to classify them as terrorists, but not these West who invade them. Ironic, is it? Irony, is it? I'm not even from the region, but please either tell the whole story or don't. Skipping the 2006 war, trying to sell the Hezbollah who started fighting, calling it war from 2 sides. Either you start to sell propaganda or you don't do research on your topic very well. Keep the old way, please. 9/11 really enough people up to believe that the part of the world is just filled with pissed off Arabs. It makes doing propaganda so easy because people fill in their own blanks based on what they know. All Zionist propaganda needs to do is leave shit out and it will reach hearts and minds. Yeah. I've never seen a Johnny Harris comment section like this. Spewing foolishly lies absolutely totally about the Iran and Syria. Guys, this video is funded. It is an ad. Brought to you by AIPAC. And Johnny, Israel escalated. Johnny, 5 seconds later, Hezbollah forced to respond. Dude, come on, no one catches the biases in editing or you want to be biased intentionally. Damn, this guy is actually saying this video wasn't pro-Israel enough. He managed to piss off everybody, dude. We found one. we found even a guy who's like, dude, what? I don't like the way you presented Israel in this. Yeah, Johnny Harris, much like Israel, on a 7-front war. Johnny Harris seemingly has opened a new front in his war. It's just interesting because, like, what is going on right now in terms of, like, anyone that dares resist against Israel, okay, and Israel's actions, is identically treated to the exact same way that people who said, why the are we invading Iraq were treated in the United States of America, like literally 1-to-1. Back then, when you said we should not invade Iraq, this is ridiculous. What the are you talking about? We shouldn't even be in Afghanistan. What the are we doing? People would turn around and say, you love Saddam Hussein. You're a terrorist sympathizer. You love Saddam. You want to mustard gas every Kurd you've ever met in your entire life. Which, ironically enough, that's what Saddam Hussein was doing in the eyes of Americans, which makes it even funnier because the Ba'ath Party is now a Sharia party, okay? A jihadist, Islamic-style Sharia party, okay? That's what they would say. And it's funny that, like, as an Iraqi whose mom is Kurdish, so much this, I used to get this all the time. It's just like, you know, they say that shit to me all the goddamn time, no matter who it is. When I'm like, hey, maybe us blowing up is not the best way forward, and we can't really keep this up. We can't really keep this attitude up. Did the PLO randomly just decide one day that they would attack the IDF? This video is totally biased and misleading. Disappointed. Israel's a Western-backed colonial state in the Middle East and an apartheid state. His neighbors are either turning a blind eye or fighting against it, and the reason to fight is the political game that is being played. As a Jordanian from the region, you didn't even scratch the surface of the conflict. I like how he says the PLO moves into South Lebanon, creating their own mini-state, but Israel invaded it despite Israel having the backing of the LAF. Nice journalism. Again, we found another person who is like saying, you're not kind enough to Israel. Respect. I like seeing those guys in a sea of people being like, what are you saying, dude? This reads like pro-Israeli propaganda. There's still guys who are like, I don't really appreciate how you criticize Israel. He got Palestinians and Israelis to agree on something at least. Yes.